So I'm back with another bit of a ramble here, and this one might be a bit longer than usual. I saw a post this week about Cinder Surprise on Reddit, which I know going to Reddit, but it was discussing about how difficult Cinder Surprise is, and I want to talk about how fishing has changed over the past, uh, well, basically since A Realm Reborn and how that has impacted and how the changes at least have impacted the a little bit of the difficulty, but really just how the changes have impacted how we approach fishing and how in some cases it's actually addressed difficulty in a way. Different aspects of it, not all of it, but we'll get to that. So I think this is probably going to be entitled The History of Fishing Part 1. Probably because I might do, there's a lot. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to start talking about fishing from the beginning. So when we talk about fishing in A Realm Reborn, you really look at from the very beginning, when 2.0 launched, you had four skills basically. You had bait, you had cast, you had hook, and you had quit. Not rest, quit. Cast light, sneak, and release didn't show up until later. Like 2.2 for cast light. Sneak came in somewhere, I couldn't figure out where. Release, and then and mooch. Sorry, mooch was there at launch as well. My list is backwards. And that was it. And you had the basically all the fish were designed around those skills. Those ended up being, well, I mean, five impactful skills, four impactful skills really. Actually, no, it would be three, but technically, if you count bait, four. Anyways, doesn't matter. Um, Whenever an expansion comes out, the fish are ideally, with the exception of I think Endwalker, um, are ideally designed around the skills that you get and ask you to use the skills that you've learned previously. So in A Realm Reborn, there wasn't much. So this is why you see a lot of fish in A Realm Reborn that are either very rare or very slippery or are now just simple mooches. Um, and that was the initial difficulty for fish. We didn't see any super rare fish. The legendary fish like Helicoprion, Shonisaurus, Neptodragon, Endoceras, those guys can be down for a couple of days at most, but usually you don't see the massive downtimes that we see starting in Heavensward with like Bob Goblin Bass, where sometimes it could be down for 2 weeks. Didn't really see that at all in A Realm Reborn because they didn't really have skills to address that. That because you don't really have the skills to tackle a window very quickly. You really just had to show up and you cast it, and if it wasn't what you wanted, you waited for it to stop biting, and then you just cast it again. And if it is what you wanted, you hope that it sticks, and if it didn't, that sucks. Try again. And if it was a mooch, you hope that it was large size because mooch only works with large size fish, or at the time, high quality fish. So you had no control over things. And so the difficulty, this is kind of the first part of the difficulty of fish, was when people talk about this fish is hard, they talk about rarity and they talk about slipperiness. So, for an example, going to Cinder Surprise usually gets cited as being a very difficult fish because it is very rare within the windows, and its rarity of the windows is pretty high, and it is slippery. Like it's not a guaranteed bite like some other fish are that are rare, like Bob Goblin Bass, Duskfish, or even potentially Deep Haunt. You have a lot of things going against you. And it's not just Cinder Surprise. There's actually, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the rarity of fish, of like what, or I should say, which fish are actually like rare. It's the second one in the blue window in the Sea of Clouds, and floating boulder in Gridania, just north of not Falgord's Float, just south of Buscaran Druthers, or whatever that little area is. Um, just out of that, like those are the two rarest fish in the game, and yet they don't really have the same notoriety. And as say Cinder or Ruby or Aelidscon or Lancet fish, I mean they're all straight catch fish with the exception of Ruby. But the third factor that comes in is the ability to actually get to the window. With the second one and the floating boulder, there is a very likely chance that you're going to be able to get to a few windows a week, whether you work, whether you're on vacation, or you're just busy. There's a good chance that you'll actually be able to make a window. With Cinder, because the windows are so rare, even if it is down for 3-4 days, it might come back up at a rough time. Same thing with Aelidscon, Ruby Dragon, Lancet Fish. They all have. I've all seen complaints around those about like, hey, well, yeah, Ruby's up for the next, Ruby's up 3 times over the next 3 weeks, but it's all when I'm working or I'm asleep. And so this is kind of the third part of the rarity conversation is, are you actually able to reach that window? And you didn't have that issue too much in A Realm Reborn because a lot of the fish were relatively common uptime. Like I was saying, like it's usually like Nepto Dragon. Actually, Nepto's actually pretty common. It would be Helicoprion. I see Shonisaurus, as I'm recording right now, is on like a multi-day downturn or downtime, which is actually kind of rare from what I've seen. But like Helicoprion, I've seen take 2-3 day breaks, but that was it. And they weren't. But that was rare for it to take that rare of a downturn. It's a relatively common uptime. You're gonna probably see it 2-3 times. So fishing in A Realm Reborn, when it comes to difficulty, was mostly a persistence thing. You didn't have to worry too much about being able to make the window because one would be there. You just had to show up and you had to fish. And that's all the skills really enabled you to do. You casted or you hooked, and if you got a high quality fish, at the time it was high quality, you would then mooch it. And that was kind of it for that. There was a bit more difficulty that has since been removed of you didn't have the exclamation points over your head. Before Shadowbringers, this is like technically a relatively new addition. You had to listen to the sound of the rod and look at the animation to determine what type of bite it was. There's I think I have a video on it where I show like a light bite, the rod flexes just a little bit, and then like a strong bite, it bounces a little bit more, and then like a ferocious bite, it's like curled over. You had to add that. That was part of how you engaged with fishing, was you had to be very attentive to that. You got away with it if you had a controller, because the controller, and this hasn't changed, the controller would vibrate 1, 2, or 3 times depending on the type of bite you have. So a lot of people would be able to fish effectively blind before they added the sound effects of the exclamation points and even the exclamation points themselves, because they would just have a controller and could just be in the other room cooking, and they would be like, oh, I'm waiting for a ferocious bite. And if they just heard their controller vibrate once, they waited 2 seconds, 2-3 seconds, and then just hit the buttons to cast back out again. And there was another feedback to it that they could hear that was successful. And they waited. I know one person said that they caught Ruby Dragon without even looking at their screen because they had the controller set up. I think they had like a PlayStation set up. And they were in the kitchen cooking, and one day they were mooching Cure, and then they were hitting the buttons like, why can't I mooch a Cure? And then they would walk to their living room, which is right around the corner, and go, oh, I just caught Ruby Dragon, and be able to do that. So To kind of reel that back in on A Realm Reborn, um, we A Realm Reborn was very much what a lot of veteran fishers would call pure fishing. It's cast, it's hook, and if you get a high quality fish, you can mooch it. That was it. And that was how we started. And not a lot of people engaged with fishing because that was not very engaging. It was very attentive. There wasn't as many rewards. It was kind of dull. And yeah, it was a little bit difficult to figure out how that all worked. And so when Heavensward comes out, we have our first big change to fishing. And this is the first time that we see how Square Enix is going to be, I don't want to say nerfing, but basically, oh gosh, probably changing how you would approach older fish and how older fish are how there's going to be progression, basically. So before we get into what Heavensward brought, I want to explain a little bit how big fishing just works in general. Uh, Big fish are the rare or unique fish of a fishing hole. Effectively, every fishing hole in the game has one big fish and one legendary fish, with the exception of a few. Privateer Sterncastle has one legendary fish, that's Nepto Dragon, but no big fish. Prism Lake only has Warden of the Seven Hues, which is a legendary fish. Um, and each of these big and legendary fish have a gathering minimum requirement. So in order to catch Ruby Dragon, you need to have 1,300 gathering or more effectively. But it's a binary thing. It's not like botany or mining where the more you have, the easier it is. It's, do you have 1,300? Yes or no. If no, then you get a message saying, hey, your gathering rating is too low. You are unable to reel in the fish. If it's over it, then you don't gain any benefit. You just have to hit that minimum level. So if you wanted to experience what it was like to fish for, say, Ruby Dragon during Stormblood, just you don't need to have more gear. You just need to have less GP and only use the skills that you had available to you during Stormblood launch. And so when you look at progression for combat, the more your gear is, the more damage you do, and thus the easier older fights are going to be, even when you're like level synced or eye level synced or eye level capped. Even like if you do like Hullbreaker Isle, which is just like a level 50 thing at level 50, if you're in level 50 gear before, like when it was live, like when it first came out, it's going to take you longer because you're doing less damage. But now if you go in with like 55, 60, 80, 90, 100 gear, you're going to be doing the maximum amount of damage that you can be doing, and so it's a little bit quicker. Same thing with raids. Like usually you'll see people, if you go in and do like one of the Heavensward raids now, it's a whole lot quicker. I think actually a good example of this is Cypress Tower, and like the Crystal Tower raids. Those are way different experiences now because everyone's over geared than they were at launch when everyone was just in level 50 gear, because you're less damage output, less healing output, stuff like that. And on top of that, you can unsync. You can unsync combat, so you can come in at full gear, full power, and just like one hit Ramu. Or actually, I don't think you can actually one hit Ramu, but you can one hit Garuda, one hit I want to say Ifrit, but I could be wrong about Ifrit. But I know you can one hit Garuda for sure. Point is, there's a power increase with combat. For fishing, we don't see that. The higher your gear, like I was saying, the higher your gear doesn't equate to how easier it is for your fish to stay on. There might be a smidgen of an increase, but in reality, outside of outside of common fish, it doesn't matter. Like, again, for big fish, it's that binary. Do you have 1300 gathering? If yes, cool, you have a chance to catch Ruby Dragon. If no, then you can't catch it at all. And the way that those the way that like that interacts is because big fish have fixed slip rates and fixed bite, or like fixed slip and bite rates, meaning a big fish could have a 90% chance to slip flat. Doesn't matter what your gathering is. The power creep that you would get isn't going to be coming from your gear, with the exception of GP, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. You aren't going to have, the higher you're gathering, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're going for a level 50 fish like Fairy Queen, which is a very slippery fish, or the Matriarch, which is like the slipperiest fish. Doesn't matter if you're level 100 gear. Matriarch don't care. Matriarch gonna slip. And so you're probably now wondering, well, how do fish get easier? And the fish themselves don't, with one exception. And I'll come up to that in a second. There's been one exception to this. Fish themselves don't get easier. The skills you get from each expansion makes more opportunities to catch that fish. And that's how fish get, quote unquote, easier. And it's not uniform. It's not like every fish in like Shadowbringers got easier in Endwalker. It's very much on a fish by fish basis. So if we talk about what came in Heavensward, and here's what was added in Heavensward. I have the list of skills. Snagging, Collector's Glove, Patience, Powerful Hook Set, Chum, Precision Hook Set, Fish Eyes, the old Fish Eyes, and Patience 2. And if you were noting that, I said Powerful Hook Set, Chum, and then Precision Hook Set. When they were launched, Powerful Hook Set and Precision Hook Set weren't the same level. You actually got Powerful Hook Set first at level 51 with Patience, and then at level 56 you got Precision Hook Set, and both of them cost 74 GP compared to the 50 that they are now. So the big change that came in Heavensward was the introduction of Patience. Chum as well, but I think Patience was really the big change, because now you can basically force high quality fish. That was something that was big, that we still test today, of like, what's the minimum perception needed. It's usually very, very low to actually guarantee that high quality fish. And with Heavensward's update, a lot of a Realm Reborn fish got effectively what many would call nerfed. But when fishers talk about a fish getting nerfed, it means that it gets more opportunities to be caught during a window. So let's take Shonisaurus, for example. That's a legendary fish. In a Realm Reborn, in order to get a Shonisaurus, you had to first get a high quality cloud cutter, mooch it into a Mahar. So it had to bite into a Mahar, and that Mahar had to be high quality to be able to even have a chance at Shonisaurus. In a Realm Reborn, you didn't have Patience, so you couldn't force or otherwise sway those fish into being high quality. So you had to hope and get lucky that it was going to be high quality. And if it wasn't, you had to try again. And there's nothing else you could do with that. So you hoped it, you got it. And it was, so really all of Shonisaurus was, could you get lucky 3 times in a row? Could you get lucky and get the cloud cutter? Could you get lucky that was high quality? Could you get lucky off that cloud cutter and get the high quality Mahar? And then could you get lucky and get a Shonisaurus that actually stuck? Because Shonisaurus does slip. But if we look at that same fish, if we look at Shonisaurus now, in Heavensward, you could pop Patience 2, and if you got the Cloud Cutter, there was a very good chance that it was going to be high quality, because you'd be using Powerful Hook Set, and then you would be able to mooch that, and you would very likely be a high quality Mahar, and then you would mooch that again, and then then basically the only luck that you had to have was the Shonisaurus going to stick around? Like, was it going to stay on the line? And was it going to actually, uh, um, was the bites that you wanted to get actually going to be, like off the Cloud Cutter Mooch? Was it going to be a Mahar? Shonisaurus always bites off of Mahar Mooch, so that's not that. There's no RNG there, but it's really just did the Cloud Cutter. You basically didn't have to get lucky 3 times in a row. You just had to be partially lucky twice. Were you going to get the high? Like, were you going to get a Cloud Cutter? That was easy to isolate because it was a very similar bite, or a very isolatable bite. And then were you going to get the Mahar in Heavensward? And that's how it was nerfed, is because now you had more options. You didn't have to hope that you got the Cloud Cutter and it was large size. You took one of those elements away. And so you were seeing much more, basically much more chances at Shonisaurus, which means that you were spending less time going for it, which would, to many people, be easier because it didn't take as much time. That's one of the things that Cinder Surprise gets talked about a lot, is it takes a long time to catch. It's like the second longest fish to catch pre-Endwalker. I think like the top 3 are Ruby Dragon, an estimate of like 60 days if you hit every window. Cinder Surprise is like 48, and like Aelid Scon's like 27 or something like that. Estimates, of course. And so with the new skills, that time to take that time to actually get a chance, or to actually catch a fish, went down because you were getting more options and more abilities to actually get more chances at it. And so this is how we see a lot of nerfs happen with fish, is you just get that more options to it, or something that makes it a lot more direct. It takes away an RNG element to it. So on top of that all, patience, with the addition of patience, we have made fishing a lot more engaging, because now you had to pay attention to your GP, you had to pay attention to you had to pay attention to GP, which you didn't do in a Realm Reborn really at all, because Mooch doesn't cost anything. None of the other skills cost anything. It wasn't until Heavensward when you had to actually pay attention to GP. And so it became more engaging. It came a little bit quicker. Even Chum, which was originally a level 54 skill and cost much more than it did now, in terms of GP, it still reduced the bite time of a fish, which means if you're going for floating boulder, instead of casting, waiting 20 seconds, it's not it, wait for it to go away, cast back out, you can now do that in 10. Because you'd be able to use Chum every so often. You didn't have a huge GP pool, so you couldn't use Chum very often, but Patience and Chum were like 2 of the biggest impacts on fishing. And so cool, they've made it now that the older fish are a bit easier, are a bit more accessible, are a bit more quicker to get. And so how do they balance that out? They introduce fish that utilize the new skills that are very patience heavy, or very mooch heavy, or are require the old fish eyes, which for those who didn't know how old fish eyes worked, fish eyes up until patch, I believe it was 5.3, there were fish in Heavensward, Stormblood, and early Shadowbringers, where you had to use fish eyes to be able to even have a chance to catch a fish. So it was like a on-demand intuition, fish's intuition. Like it was a buff basically that had a certain time duration, and while it was up, you had a chance to actually catch that fish. Catch a specific fish. And you saw this utilized a lot. It was used originally for Opabinia. It was used for Problematicus. not for them specifically, but it was used for Fossil Tongue, which was part of the intuition to get Problematicus. You had to use it for functional Proto-Hropkin, for Opabinia, and a whole bunch of other ones. The issue with it was, and this is where some of the frustrations around fishing came up, and a bit of a level of difficulty, was fish eyes cost 550 GP. It was not 550. Sorry, that's what it is now. It's it was like 250 or something like that. It was a good chunk of your GP, and some fishing holes had multiple fish that required fish eyes. I can remember the flagship where you catch Opabinia. If you were going for Opabinia, there was a chance that you would get if you used fish eyes, there was a 50-50 chance that you got the functional Proto-Hropkin duration, and this is how you knew what it was. You had to look at the duration that you got. It didn't say, oh, fish eyes for Proto-Hropkin. It was just like, oh, it's 120 seconds. You had to hope that you got the one for the fish you wanted. So at the flagship, you would have fish eyes, and if you got one duration, you're like, cool, that's functional Proto-Hropkin. That's what I want. If you got another duration, you're like, crap, that's for Barrel Eye, and I don't want that. And so you had to use it again. And so you had this huge GP sink, which, in my opinion, was like the one flaw. This was the one flaw with fish eyes, is that they had multiple fish eyes fish at the same hole, and you had no way of controlling which buff you were going to get. I think the idea of having that type of buff that is a GP sink from the start, so you can't start with full GP, and it was a good chunk of your GP, was actually a very good design idea. It was just poorly implemented in some of these fishing holes. And so this is where the challenge started coming up, was of one, you had to get lucky to make sure you had the right fish eyes. But ignoring that, you now had to expend half to a third of your GP, if not more, depending on how you were melded, to even have a chance at the fish. And so now you're working with a smaller amount of GP. And this will become a running theme for fish in Heavensward and Stormblood, and even into Shadowbringers, of GP management. This is the first time that we've seen this come up, where you have very expensive skills, and now you have to make sure that you're not blowing all your GP at one. Like Botany and Minor, they have rotations for, if you want X thing, spend 1,000 GP and you'll get 1,000, like a 1,000 collectability thing. With fishing, we don't have that. And so now it was very on the fly thought, like decision making that you had to do going through Heavensward's fishing holes. Like I remember going for Opabinia in Stormblood before Fish Eyes was removed, and it was honestly a very fun fish. Right now, it is almost probably like the second or third easiest legendary fish now. But at the time, it was one of the hardest ones, because you had to get the right fish eyes. You had to make sure you had the right you had enough GP to be able to mooch. You had to make sure that you had the right bait. You could only use fiend worms. You can't use signature skyball to guarantee platinum fish. So you had to use fiend worms to be able to actually get the platinum fish, and those weren't always going to bite. So you had to figure that out. And then did you have enough GP to actually use Patience 2 to guarantee that it was high quality? Probably not. So you had to go and use Patience 1, which wasn't going to guarantee it. And you didn't have Mooch 2. So even if you got an average size one, you couldn't do anything with it. And so Opabinia was a rather difficult fish. And you had, that was kind of a theme with the rest of Heavensward, was the legendary fish, and even some of the non-legendary fish were at the time kind of difficult, because they had a lot of decision making. And this is like the fourth facet of difficulty. Opabinia is up pretty commonly. Most of the Heavensward fish are up pretty commonly, but they are also still considered some of the hardest because they're rare. They require a lot of thinking a lot of on-demand decision making and thinking to make sure that you're getting opportune chances to be able to actually catch the fish. They had a lot of waiting for your GP to regen. You didn't have enhanced GP regeneration show up until Stormblood, so we were still at 5 GP a tick. And so you had all of these things to consider. And that is what made Heavensward fish, one, in my opinion, so much fun, but two, very difficult. Not because they were rare. Some of them were. Charbonnet, sea butterfly are still very rare. But because they required so much thought. I still think Heavensward fish and some of the Stormblood fish are like some of the best designed fish, even now, even at level 100, because they require so much of this decision making and understanding of skills and being able to on the fly go, yes, if I use this skill now, I'll have enough GP to regenerate in time to be able to use this next skill if I get this, but if I don't, then I have to do that. And so much thought. And so Heavensward was really kind of the first time, one of the first times that we see fishing come out as, fishing got hands. Like this isn't just a side thing for folks. This isn't just going to be a little quick thing that you can take care of in a week. This is going to take time. This is going to take thought. This is going to take understanding. And so that's one of those things with Heavensward that whenever I go through Heavensward fish, I always keep in mind of like, man, these are still kind of how they were meant to be, because a lot of these fish didn't change much in terms of how much thought you have to put into them. The skills changed. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but you still have to keep thinking about them. So, kind of a recap of where we're at, because it's been, about a half hour. We're at the end of Heavensward. We've talked about what makes, what difficulties did fish have at that time. And in Realm Reborn, it was really just rarity and slip rate. We didn't really have any huge downtime fish, so that wasn't really a difficulty people had to overcome. It was just pure RNG, pure rarity, pure slipperiness. Heavensward comes in and removes one of those layers of RNG. Are you going to be able to get large size fish or high quality fish at the time? So it takes that away, but doesn't really do much to address the slip rate or the rarity. And that is something that I will say, and spoilers, never gets addressed. As of whatever day it is today, patch 7.0, there are no skills that will, well, actually, I shouldn't say fully. There are no skills that address slip rate. There's nothing that will say if a fish is 90% slippery and will slip 90% of the time, there are no skills to address that. There is now technically skills that will address rarity, but even then, it still is, a lot of fish are still rare because it scales based off their initial bite rate. So I completely forgot about that for a second. But here at Heavensward, in this point in time, the big thing that a lot of people were, the big fish were the Heavensward legendary fish. We saw nerfs to the Realm Reborn fish through Patience, and Patience 2, because now you could guarantee, or more reliably guarantee, high quality fish, which made mooching a whole lot easier. You had Chum, which you couldn't use as often as you could now, but you could still use it, which made the straight catch fish like Floating Boulder or Shadow Streak, those fish a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. You were able to get, instead of maybe 15 casts per window, you might have been able to get 20, which is a increased chance that you could actually catch the fish in that window, which is decreasing the amount of time it takes to bite. or it takes to actually get the catch. So we saw this first round of here's how Square Enix is going to handle fishing progression. And it is through the skills. It is not through gear. Basically, in the same way, at least, that combat is. It is through the skills that you get. The fish don't change. That's the one thing that I think was the interesting thing that came out of Heavensward was none of the fish got, like, in Heavensward there was no update saying fish found in a Realm Reborn now bite 20% more often. Like, that didn't happen. And they made that very, and I think that was a very clear precedent that they set, was the fish aren't going to change, just your skills are, and you need to be able to learn how to use those skills. And that I think, and that has basically been the case since then. Nothing has changed on that, with one exception. We're going into Stormblood. So Heavensward comes out. We had all those fish there. Notable fish in Heavensward were Duskfish, Charbonnet, Rhomdolopterus, Ruby Dragon, all the, like, Opabinia at the time, all the legendary fish, Bobogoblin Bass. I said Duskfish earlier. Duskfish was Stormblood. Bobogoblin Bass was Heavensward. Soul the Martyr was the longest at the time, longest biting fish. I think it might be number 2 now behind Deep Haunt, but it's like a 40, 50 second bite at most. Soul of the Martyr. And we're coming into this like, okay, we have to understand all these new skills now. There are some new mechanics. We had fish eyes. We had to manage our GP. And so going into Stormblood, this is what Square Enix is now going to address. How do you manage, like, can you manage GP? Can you, how can we make some of these mooch fish? There was a lot of mooch fish in Heavensward. Notable mooch fish, at least. How are they going to address that? We saw fish like Charbonnet and Sea Butterfly had intuitions that required multiple fish. Multiple fish. So, like, Charbonnet requires 5 Ice Fairy. We even saw this back in A Realm Reborn with Cornelia and Imperial Goldfish, both of them requiring multiple of a single fish. So they're like, okay, how are they going to address this? How are they going to address those fish that are older? And how are they going to make it so that we can get more opportunities to fish with them? Are they even going to be able to do that? And they did. With Stormblood, we saw not just the addition of original spearfishing, which I'll try and touch on really quick in a little bit, but we got, notably, Mooch 2 and Double Hook as the overworld fish. We also got, for spearfishing, we had Fathom, Shark Eye, Gig Head, which, if you started playing an Endwalker, you have no idea what that is. Veteran Trade, Calm Waters, Shark Eyes 2, Truth of the Oceans, Salvage, Bountiful Catch, and Nature's Bounty. Also notable in patch 4.2, consumables were able to be used while fishing. And now this isn't while your rod is out. This is while you're in the fishing stance. Before 4.2, if you needed to use a cordial, you had to put away your rod, drink the cordial, and put it back. So if you had just used patience, good luck. Like, sorry, you're going to lose it if you have to use a cordial. So that was one. So just like that, a little thing kind of just was a bit of a quality of life thing. Really made it so you didn't have to think like, oh crap, do I have to, should I do this or not? They were just like, no, don't worry about it. You can use your cordial or you eat your food before you cast while maintaining your buffs. So Mooch 2 and Double Hook, not as big of a change, not as big of an impact in my opinion as Patience and Chum in Heavensward, but Double Hook did make fish like Sea Butterfly, Charbonnet, Rhomdolopterus, Cornelia, Imperial Goldfish, all these other, all these multi-fish intuition trigger fish. Sorry, words are hard there. A little bit easier at the cost of, you'd spend 400 GP and you'd get 2, maybe 3, but 2 of those fish. And basically it was a time saver of, could you save time by spending 400 GP? Can you manage your GP enough to be able to actually get more intuition, more opportunities to trigger that intuition during a window while maintaining GP and maintaining that? If you want to see how many intuitions you got for a sea butterfly, go single hook all of the, without metal spinner. I should point out, I know metal spinner right now for sea butterfly is meta. Go use giant crane flies. Go single catch all the intuition that you need, all the stuff for intuition you need without using identical cast, without using double hook. Go single catch everything and see how many intuitions you get in Sea Butterfly's window. That's what it was like pre-Stormblood. Then start using just double hook without, again, still with giant crane fly. Now use double hook and see what that difference is. That was the impact that had on those fish. And with Mooch 2, now if you fail, like if you caught the fish that you needed to mooch, but lost for whatever reason, like maybe you didn't have enough GP to use Patience 2, or you were using Patience 1 where you didn't guarantee a large size fish. With Mooch 2, now you could, on a cooldown and for a GP price, you could mooch that average size fish. So you had more, not huge, again, not as big as Patience, but you still had more opportunities to actually be able to mooch. And it works. I mean, Mooch 2 works just like Mooch 1, with the exception of Mooch 2 is on a cooldown and it requires 100 GP. So the way that it ended up working was you could use Patience 2, and then you could use Mooch 2. And then once Mooch 2 went on cooldown, you would use Patience 2. And that was a loop that we kept using until Endwalker. Like that was like, it actually fits really like it. I'm pretty confident it was designed that way, but it felt they fit together well. Of you use Patience 2, once that runs out, you use Mooch 2, and once you use Mooch 2, you would prepare to be able to use Patience 2 again, and it would last basically the whole duration of Mooch 2. Like that was the loop, and that made a lot of moochable fish really nice to use. Like you could now have much higher mooching uptime, which means, again, going back to what we were saying before, of lowering that, lowering the time it takes to catch a fish by increasing the amount of opportunities you get to catch that fish. And so that's where we started seeing that with Stormblood. On top of that, we got our first GP regen trait. That was, in Heavensward, I was saying GP management was big. Well, in Stormblood, now you get 6 instead of 5. You get 1 more GP per tick. Yeah. And that could be pretty powerful in reality. You were able to actually get, a little bit more. You had GP a little bit quicker. You could move between windows and still have more GP than you did before. So you could have, you didn't rely on cordials as much, but you still had to use them. But again, it was basically, they had to take what was Heavensward missing with what we added. And how could we make that a little bit better? And that's where Mooch 2 and Double Hook came in. I think the big thing, though, to talk about for Stormblood, even though it doesn't relate to, doesn't really relate directly to big fishing, but it is something historical in fishing, is that they added a new type of fishing. They added spearfishing. It was required to unlock to finish the story quest, even though you weren't. I don't think it popped. It didn't pop up as like a quest thing, because that even was like in the upper left hand corner, everyone knows like, oh, here's the next quest you have to get, and then underneath that it'll say like if you're on like Fisher, it'll say here's the next Fisher quest you have to do, or like Dancer or something like that. Like I don't even think that, I don't recall, but I don't think that was a thing in Stormblood. Like that didn't come in until Shadowbringers. Shadowbringers was like the quality of life update expansion. Um, but you had spearfishing, which massive expansion to the fishing guide, and added a new way to fish. But the original spearfishing is not like what it is now, like changed in Endwalker. Um, it was it was really, honestly, okay. The only way that I think I can describe it is it was botany and mining, but worse. Like genuinely spearfishing in Stormblood was neat, but it kind of wasn't that engaging. It really felt like they added it as a way to get more people to level Fisher because they realized, not everyone wanted to engage with the way overworld fishing was done. So they made something that seemed a lot like Botany or Miner. There were individual nodes, like there are now, teeming waters, but instead of a window popping up and you seeing all these fish go by, you had to wait for bubbles to appear. And then once the bubbles appeared, you use Gig and you would spear like you do now. And you just get a fish. It'd be like a random fish. So you had that RNG aspect, but it wasn't pure random because the type of fish you get depended on the type of gig head you used. And there was 3 types. There was small, medium, and large. And that was kind of like the bait equivalent, I guess, of spearfishing. Was if you wanted to get, say, like a tiny Tatsunoko, which is the minion up near the wreck of Kobayashi Maru, you had to use, I think it was a small gig head. If you used the medium or a large one, you wouldn't get the fish, and you couldn't see the fish, and you weren't told that, like you weren't told which one required which. You just had to know, and so you had to basically hope you got what you needed. If you didn't, you had to go on to the next node, do it again. The one interesting thing though with spearfishing was the skill veteran trade, where if you speared a fish and you used veteran trade, it would remove that fish from the pool. We hadn't seen that before. Surface Slap didn't even exist at that time. Surface Slap didn't come in until level 71 in Shadowbringers. So you're like, oh, well, this is a neat skill now. And now I have control over effectively the RNG. You have control over the bite rates effectively of these pools of like, if I veteran trade this fish, which fish am I going to get more often? Which is the most common one? And there was some data on that. I haven't seen it, but I know like some of the like trackers like Teamcraft, they can't track spearfishing because it's a different, like the way that it's set up, it just isn't trackable. So we actually have a bit of a bite rate blind spot when it comes to old spearfishing. But it was interesting that this skill was introduced in a way because once you slapped or veteran traded a fish, it didn't show up for the teeming waters for the rest of the time. So like if you got like a fuchsia bloom on the first one and you didn't want it, you would use veteran trade, and out of the remaining 3, I think, because it worked just like botany and mining where it had integrity or gathering power or whatever they wanted to call it. You had like whatever 3 or 4 more spears you would have if you got it at the beginning. You weren't going to see it for the rest of the time. And then you had the other interesting skill of, I believe it was Bountiful Catch, where it was effectively, no, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. It's been a while since I had to look at the old one. I got ahead of myself, but sorry, I was thinking more of Nature's Bounty, and Bountiful Catch. Basically, you had a skill that just gave you high quality versions, which was effectively like patience, which was handy back when you needed to use high quality for Grand Company turn-ins. For a while, actually even now, the spearfish for Grand Company turn-ins are probably the most quote-unquote lucrative because no one wanted to deal with them, especially ones that had swimming shadows, which was another new mechanic introduced, which was effectively if you caught or speared X amount of a certain fish, then another node would show up that you got one chance at, and then you'd have to catch all the fish again to summon it again, basically. That was kind of one of those things where you were like, oh, this is a new and interesting mechanic. And in my mind, it kind of worked like ephemeral nodes that, like, I think if you want to think about it, like ephemeral nodes show up for X amount of time twice a day or once a day, depending on like the node. That's effectively like a rough equivalent for swimming shadows. And there would be unique fish in there. Usually the Grand Company turn-ins or like the Lev fish would be in there. The level 64, I think, job quest where you have to go spearfishing. That's tied to swimming shadows, and that's how they actually teach you about swimming shadows. So spearfishing added the addition of spearfishing was this really interesting new take on fishing, and it was showing like, oh, they want to invest a little bit more into fishing, not just the overworld fishing, but really show like, oh, there's more to fishing here beyond just a rod. And that was notable and interesting, and down the road, spearfishing actually becomes very important for fishers and fishing identity later on in Endwalker and Dawn Trail. But going back to overworld fishing, with Stormblood, we get some of the, at the time, most notable fish. Some of the fish that are some of the most technically challenging fish in the game. We have Ruby Dragon, which is considered the rarest fish in the game, behind, if not tied with or behind Cinder Surprise. We have Stethacanthus. We had Warden of the Seven Hues. We had Drepanapsis, which was way different experience then than it is now. And they were utilizing all of these skills from beforehand. So like Ruby Dragon, you really had to use patience too, and you really had to know how to manage your GP, and you were using Mooch too to be able to keep up Mooch uptime. Stethacanthus was, for the longest time, one of the only fish that we actually recommended using Patience 1 for. It's a shorter duration, but it wasn't a huge GP sink, and you had to use double hook with the strat that we ended up with using collectibles, which I didn't note. Collectibles were added in Heavensward, and so were folklore books, which was just like another, not like a necessarily barrier, but it was just like another thing that you had to do. But like with Stethacanthus, they introduced some genuinely rare fish that you had to deal with, and how were you going to address it? And that's how we have like the collector's glove holding trick with sculptors for Stethacanthus, because of double hook. And you have to double hook, and like the method for catching Stethacanthus was very GP heavy, and it required fish eyes. Like, hands down, one of my favorite fishing experiences, and I caught my first Stethacanthus this way, was fish eyes to catch sculptors while using double hook in the Patience 1 method. Like, hands down, I would argue that is the most difficult fish to catch. That was one of the most difficult fish, just because the pure technicality of it was so high. Anyways, I'm a little off track on that, but we had to really utilize those skills on top of the previous skills now, which now we actually, with Heavensward introducing like actual meaty skills, Stormblood is the first time that we got to look and see how were those old skills going to be needed? How were they going to be utilized? And the answer is very heavily. So they keep between A Realm Reborn and Heavensward and Stormblood, we were starting to see this historical precedence of each new expansion adds something unique and requires you to use everything that you've used before, everything you've known before. And this, I think, is one of the barriers and levels of difficulty that new fishers note is there is a lot. If you wanted to start fishing in Dawn Trail, there is a lot. Not just of fish, there's like 17,000 fish at the time of recording. 1,700. Ooh, not 17,000. 1,700 fish at the time of recording. And there's a ton of skills. It fills out people's bars. We didn't get any sort of reduction of skills. So we have like a bunch of skills. Like we actually now have a list of like, these are skills you probably don't need, like release or release list. Like you probably don't need those. You can take those off your bar. There's a lot. And that's because they have that historical precedence now of Heavensward built off of A Realm Reborn, Stormblood built off of not Heavensward, but Heavensward and A Realm Reborn. So Shadowbringers built on the previous 3, Endwalker, the previous 4. Dawn Trail is like all of them. And that is what I think makes like the history of fishing so interesting, because it's not like, you know, skills come and go. They do a little bit. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But you don't, the core of fishing is the fish. And they never change, much like the bosses that we fight in raids. Their potencies don't change. The mechanics don't change. Just everything around them. Like we just get more powerful, thus meaning we never actually see them. Unlike with fishing, where we still see all of the mechanics, we still see them. We just have more ways of handling them. And to kind of end the Stormblood arc, this is during Stormblood is the first time, and I will note only time, we have seen a direct patch note saying that fish bite rates were changed. And this was specifically, I believe, for Heavensward fish. But what happened was fish like Opabinia, they felt were a little bit too rare. So they increased their bite rate a little bit. Not a lot, but just a little bit. And that is the first and only time that we've had an actual notable, true, quote unquote, nerf to fish. The fish themselves. Beyond that, the fish have never changed. We've never actually seen that patch note ever again. We haven't really done anything. We haven't observed that was like implemented without being noted. But that was something that happened in the Heavensward Stormblood era that is worth noting, of fish just actually got nerfed one day. So I think I've touched on everything so far that I've wanted to in this timeline of A Realm Reborn to Stormblood. I'm hoping that I've been able to paint a little bit of a better picture of how fishing changes over time and how skills get added, and how the fish themselves don't change, but the skills are what nerf the fish, not the potencies. It's not like we make it less likely for a fish to slip or more likely for a fish to bite until Dawn Trail, which I'll get to that. It's the skills, it's the opportunities, it's the ability to make decisions, it's the ability to use skills more often with more GP, or more often, or just skills, or just having more GP to begin with, I guess. The way fishing works is it just adds on new skills each patch or each expansion that complement, not necessarily nerf, but complement the previous kits. At least as of up until now into Stormblood. You know, we've seen this big term that I use for my day job is scaffolding. And basically that's what each expansion does. It takes the core of A Realm Reborn, which is pure fishing of just casting, you hook, and occasionally you get to mooch. You see this building up on that. So in Heavensward, they were like, okay, what do we need to build up on that? What's the next logical step? What's the next thing a fisher would be able to do, like in the world? What else do they need to be able to appreciate that? And then design fish around that. We see it wasn't like we saw with Double Hook when we first really started seeing some heavy like intuition requirements. Like Warden of the Seven Hues requires 11 fish. That's 3 of 2 types and then 5 of another. Really making it so that you have to utilize Double Hook. Having mooch loops, like Ruby Dragon and Cures, to make it so that you can better utilize patience, and the new skill of mooch too, and putting a lot of different things in spearfishing, like sands, stuff like that, so that you're actually spearfishing. It's always scaffolding on each other. It's not like we're getting a huge rework like some combat classes do every expansion. We'll make it sound like we're getting reworked, but at the core, we're not. Like, it's still the same. If we have a major change, which I'll discuss in part 2 when we start with Shadowbringers, if there's a major change, it's usually a meta shift rather than like an overhaul to a mechanic. So at the end of Stormblood here, we have this is the Grandmaster caster arc, I guess we could call it. This is all the legendary and big fish caught in Realm Reborn, Heavensward, and Stormblood get you the Grandmaster caster title. So I guess we'll call this like the Grandmaster caster arc of 204 big fish and all of these different skills and all these different mechanics. And in part 2, whenever I record that, we'll start with Shadowbringers. And the first massive meta shift that we see in fishing, along with the expansion that brought the most changes and like just, sorry, I guess probably not even changes. Shadowbringers was really, really big for fishing. And we'll start with that in part 2. So until then, thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. But until then, good luck and happy fishing.